Hello, everybody. It's Phil Jacobus. It's September 16th. It's Wednesday. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm here in my office in New York City. Thank you very much for joining us. Today, I'm going to share with you a pre-recorded interview with Dr. Joel Diamond, who is Chief Medical Officer for Precision Medical Company. He is what I would call a patriot, very interesting fellow. You'll really enjoy this interview, and I'm glad to be able to share it with you. But before I do, I'm going to share with you our news, some news that is on Healthcare Business News Online today. One interesting story, Sean Ruck interviewed Donna Drummond, who works for Northwell, and she shared, and Northwell was in ground zero of the pandemic here in New York, and she shared some ideas about how Northwell dealt with this and learned from it. Another very interesting story is another molecular imaging story, and it seems like we're enjoying new growth in molecular imaging every week. Radiomedics and Curium have announced a new PET agent that has a 12-hour half-life used for neurological tumors. Also interesting. Read it. You won't be sorry you did, and sign up for our news. It's free, and you'll never regret it because knowledge is power. Okay, ladies and gentlemen and viewers around the world, I'm happy today to be joined by Dr. Joel Diamond, and Dr. Diamond is the Chief Medical Officer of To Be Precise, which is a firm based in Pittsburgh. Dr. Diamond is also a practicing physician, and he describes himself as a physician first and a businessman second. So, Dr. Diamond, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. It's great to be with you today.
Now, we reached out to Dr. Diamond because he is an expert in the field of precision medicine, which is something I've learned about recently. But Dr. Diamond, for some people may be familiar or not completely familiar, would you just give us an overview of how you would define precision medicine?
Sure. I think one way of looking at it is definitely an emerging approach to disease treatment and prevention that takes into account individual variability in genes, but also in other things, including environment and lifestyle that are unique to each person. That allows doctors, and researchers, and other people to predict more accurately which treatments and which prevention strategies for a particular disease will work best for an individual. This is in contrast with the sort of trial and error approach that we've used for many, many years in medicine. And not surprisingly, we see all the different variability in how people respond, both in adverse outcomes or non-response, et cetera. And in some sense, we've been doing this for a long time. We've never defined it as precision medicine, but we would never think of giving people a blood transfusion without individualizing that blood transfusion based on their actual genetic predisposition to a blood type. But what we've learned as we've uncovered more of the human genome is this applies to a vast variety of things that we care for in the day-to-day practice of medicine.
Yes. Now, intuitively, an intelligent person intuitively understands the benefits, but just to decode it for us, can you share some benefits both for the patients and the providers of precision medicine?
Sure, and I'll give you a couple examples. I think certainly a lot of the spotlight in the last few years has been the effect of precision medicine on the treatment of cancer. And, it's not that long ago and we still to some extent treat cancer based on its anatomical site. So you either had colon cancer, or you had breast cancer, et cetera. Nowadays, it's becoming routine that if you have cancer, in addition to sending the tissue to a pathologist, it's also sent to a molecular lab. And the particular DNA fingerprint of that cancer, in fact, determines its treatment. And that treatment, you see many of them advertised on TV, may be a treatment that's useful for both lung cancer and colon cancer and breast cancer. So the anatomic site is less important, in the molecular makeup of that cancer. So already we're seeing huge strides in the last few years in cancers that we used to think were death sentences, where we have huge abilities to affect the outcome of those cancer patients based on genetics, DNA, precision medicine. I think the other areas that we're starting to see this right away are in the area of pharmacogenomics. So this idea of we give the same drug to everybody and we wonder why some people don't respond, or other individuals have an adverse effect of that drug, or why drugs that were researched and marketed to large populations later on, years later, we found out that they had adverse effects on subgroups of patients, and those drugs had to be pulled off the market. So we now know that genetics, precision medicine, can help guide us in picking the right drug for the right patient at the right time, every time, which is, one of our goals. And the other areas is looking at common things that we take care of all the time, whether that be depression and anxiety, behavioral health management, cardiovascular conditions, and you look at treating high cholesterol, difference in the way people respond to statins, or they might have a familial genetic form of hyperlipidemia that needs a very particular drug, as an example. So all of those things, we see the immediate benefits right now.
To both, I can see obviously to both patient and provider.
To both patient and provider, exactly.
I wonder if precision medicine was more universally adopted, would it have had an impact on the coronavirus, and how? And do you think it might in the future have an impact on the coronavirus?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And we're learning interesting things. I think what the coronavirus has been fascinating for many of us is the incredible variance in how people have responded to being infected by that disease. So some people asymptomatic. Why is that? Other people had cardiovascular effects of that. Some people had primary pulmonary effects of it. We're now starting to see some neurological downside of this. And there probably is a genetic basis in terms of why that might be. Our ability to respond to immunity is an example of that. Years ago, I had my own genome tested, and one of the very surprising things that I found out of that is that I was one of a very small percentage of people in the world that had a gene that is protective against HIV. We suspect that HIV protection actually comes historically probably from the reason why some people may have survived the bubonic plague many years ago. So if you look at pandemics along the way in history, the reason that some people survive some of those may be a genetic basis of that. And I suspect we will find the same for our current pandemic. And then the last piece of this is in the drug piece. I talked about pharmacogenomics, and without getting into any politics here, some of the concern and politics around which drugs might work for people and whether or not they're dangerous also has a pharmacogenomic basis to that. And bringing that into the discussion would have been much more helpful.
Yes, we don't want to talk about politics, but I agree with you. How difficult is it for a primary care physician like yourself, or in addition to being a genius, primary care physician like yourself, and or a healthcare provider on a bigger scale to implement this sort of program, this protocol, and what obstacles are in the way? What prevents everybody from just doing it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think as a family doctor for approaching 30 years now, I've seen many, many trends and advances in medicine that I would say are harder than this one. The problem, as always, is change management, and that's the obstacle. Is we get stuck in a certain way. So when I started practicing, the thought of electronically prescribing a medicine as opposed to taking out my prescription pad and writing an ineligible prescription with my fountain pen, that's changed completely over the years. The thought of using a laparoscopic approach to surgery as opposed to making a large incision of course, has changed. Imaging with MRI and PET scans. So all of these things met with opposition in the beginning because people didn't have the infrastructure or were fearful of having to learn new things. Genetics can be very, very complex, but the advice I give to most of my colleagues is most of this stuff is pretty simple. We were taught basics about how people metabolize drugs in medical school. This is just another one. We already look at patient safety information when we prescribe meds like allergies or drug-drug interactions. We're just adding a small piece to that right now. So I would say it's not hard. The other piece that a little bit of a caution to my colleagues is our patients are already way ahead of us. They're ordering the 23andMe and the Ancestry.com, and they're coming to their doctors and saying, I have a potential for this disease. What are you going to do about it? So we have to be at least as smart as our patients with this, and we should be able to preemptively offer them precision medicine options in their care at this point.
I see. I think my last question, when you look out into the future, so for instance, digital visits, that has been like accelerated from what might have taken 10 years into just a few months.
Yeah.
As a result of the coronavirus. And you mentioned how the biggest obstacle is the business side. And that's also true of data sharing, patient data sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Will the coronavirus accelerate precision medicine? When you look into your crystal ball, do you see an acceleration of embracing this protocol?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think so from a lot of different ways. I think in the beginning of this pandemic, there were some reports about, I mentioned blood type earlier, that maybe a certain blood type might actually make you more susceptible or less susceptible. And I think the public really glommed onto this early, or whether you're taking ibuprofen might affect this. So I think there's an awareness already in that's intrinsic in people that believe that there are individual variabilities in our susceptibility to diseases, including infectious diseases. So I think that's there already. So I think the pandemic in some ways has done that. I also think the pandemic has greatly flipped the way that we think about doing telemedicine and our traditional approaches to bricks and mortar, and a bigger topic. But I think precision medicine lends itself very well to a telemedicine encounter. This doesn't there's a lot that we can learn about patients without necessarily having to have them in the physical room with us. And lastly, I think the interesting thing about precision medicine, where it may apply to this, is the concept of test once, query often. Your DNA, for the most part, does not change for your entire life. So if you were to have your genome sequenced at some point in your life, and anytime a new condition arose, you can query that gene to say, do you have this response to a medication? Do you have this response to a immune difficulty at all? Or whatever the case may be. That's going to be commonplace in the future. And as I said, I think we're on the brink of that right now. But this idea of knowing that genetic background, testing it once, and then being able to apply to a lot of other areas becomes very, very important. And lastly, I think the whole area of clinical trials will change differently because this idea that we do now, where we look out at mass populations, inclusion, exclusion criteria, et cetera, I think the ability to be more precise in the way that we do clinical trials for both diseases and therapy will change greatly as well.
Now, Dr. Diamond, I can edit this question out if you're uncomfortable in answering it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And I'm happy you just can tell me to edit it out if you want. But what about people who are nervous about sharing their DNA out in the universe? Because they're not exactly anti-vaxxers, but they're privacy issues. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a great question. I have a lot of thoughts on it. First of all, I don't think that is entirely crazy. I don't think it's an anti-vaxxer thing. One of the things that we've already seen is that in some of these consumer-based tests, and including some commercial tests that are used for testing people for cancer and other diseases, people have been surprised that that data that's generated is being used for other purposes, is being bought and sold on the market, either to pharma or to other entities. And I do think that's a concern. And I think, as in all technology that's rapidly advancing, some of the social constructs around this and political issues and privacy issues need to be dealt with. So I do think we need to, as an industry and as a country, understand who owns that data. Having said that, I think that there are other ways to get around this. Listen, certainly doing a pharmacogenomic test where we're looking at a very small piece of the genome that's involved in drug safety doesn't allow somebody to have a DNA fingerprint about me and implicate me in a crime or all these other things. So I think we also have to dispel the myth that any piece of DNA data somehow is dangerous, but the public has already been very, very willing to give this data, open it up on the consumer side as well, and people need to understand that. And lastly, I still think, although we've done some strides in some legislature around insurability based on genetics, we still have a long way to go, and particularly with things like long-term care insurance and insurability for life insurance, et cetera. So I think we as a country and as scientists and as healthcare providers need to help patients understand both the myths of this and the realities of this so we can do it right.
Okay. Well, Dr. Joel Diamond, you know, you're clearly a very sensitive primary care physician, and I would describe you as being a patriot because the work that you're doing is helpful to our country, so, and the world for that matter.
It's very nice.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.